I think we'll get started. Thank you, everyone who has rejoined us for our next to last panel. So one of the things that we've tried to emphasize through the panel selection the last couple of days is to look at the array of interests that are important in terms of this field of carbon dioxide removal in the context of oceans. And so we've looked at the role of regulators, the role of legislators, both at the national level and the international level, the role of the non-governmental sector, the role of public engagement, and the role of the private sector. And one of our panels yesterday featured a number of project developers as well as foundations and corporations that are seeking to incentivize carbon dioxide removal. And today is our second panel in this context. It's entitled Case Studies in Ocean CDR Project Development Legal Aspects. And I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for this panel, which is Brad Ock, who serves as Executive Director and Chief Innovation Officer for Ocean Visions. Brad?
Thank you, Will, and hello, everybody. Good to see you. I think this has been a really interesting couple of days talking about one of the most really important parts of the equation when we look at whether or not we're going to be able to determine the contribution that ocean-based carbon dioxide removal may or may not make to ultimately combating the climate emergency that we're in. The determination of that will rest, at least in some part, on the governance and regulatory frameworks that either encourage and support and enable research and development and testing to go forward, or on the other hand, hinder that research, development, and testing. My name is Brad Ack. I am the Executive Director of Ocean Visions, which is a consortium of academic and research institutions that works in partnership with a variety of members of the private sector, accelerators, investors, entrepreneurs, innovators, to try to find, develop, and test solutions to critical challenges in the ocean. And a lot of our effort over the last year and a half has been on this critical challenge in the oceans, which is how do we reduce atmospheric and oceanic concentrations of CO2, which are causing so much damage to the oceans, either through the superheating that has happened as a result of too much energy trapped in our biosphere, or the acidification that is underway as we continue to pour more carbon pollution into the atmosphere. We have developed a series of roadmaps around the technologies that you can find on our website at oceanvisions.org/roadmaps, focused on three big domains of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. It's not an exhaustive review of all of the approaches, but we also did two additional maps that were focused on cross-cutting issues that underpin and underlie the development of this field. One of those was on governance issues. We called it social and political acceptance, but at the heart of it, it had an enormous focus on the role of effective governance, transparent governance, participatory governance in helping to stand up the kinds of experiments and developments that are going to be necessary to determine, again, what role ocean-based carbon dioxide removal will play as part of the global carbon removal that we must have in order to stabilize dangerous climate disruption. So the panel today, I'm really excited to be part of here because it is an array of practitioners, people who are trying to put the testing and development of approaches into the world, make them real, make them happen to help society answer these critical questions of the role that this approach will ultimately play. And I think people who are practitioners often have the most real world understanding of what the obstacles are and the impediments, as well as what might be really positive and constructive recommendations for how to get through some of those problems, how to move beyond them, how to create the right systems to enable better approaches. So I'm joined today, I'm gonna just go down the list alphabetically. Ken Buesseler at Woods Hole. Ken is a senior scientist in marine chemistry and geochemistry at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And Ken brings a long experience with the ocean iron fertilization research and development that I think many people will be aware of. We also have Max Chalfin from Running Tide. And Max is the director of research at Running Tide. Running Tide is a startup in the space of ocean-based carbon removal. So we're really happy to hear from you. We have Tom Green, who is the executive director of Project Vesta, which is another startup in the space of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, looking at the use of olivine on beaches to ultimately remove carbon from the ocean. Alyson Myers, who is the president of the Fearless Fund and is one of the Mariner program grantees looking at macroalgae-based approaches to carbon sequestration. And last but not least, last alphabetically only, Bren Smith, who is the executive director of GreenWave and also the owner of the Thimble Island Ocean Farm. And Bren has been leading the way in multi-trophic aquaculture systems on the East Coast of the US and beyond. And so we have a great amount of experience here in people actually trying to get things done. The way we're going to run the panel is that each of the panelists is going to take about 5 minutes, further introduce yourself, please, as you like, and talk more directly about your experience with the ocean-based approach that you're most familiar with. First, maybe describe what that approach is. Just briefly, I think most people will be familiar with the details of the technology. More importantly, what has been the interaction with regulatory and governance structures as you have tried to test and develop your particular approach. And then we will come back to a series of questions going deeper on those topics. And I'm going to go again alphabetically just because I always come first in the alphabet. And so I've just developed a strong allegiance to alphabetical approaches. And so Ken Buesseler, please.
Thanks, Brad. And I'm glad to follow the letter A, Buesseler. So as he said, I'm a scientist in Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And I distinctly remember John Martin in my early days coming to Woods Hole and talking about, give me half a tanker of iron, I'll give you the next ice age, right? This concept that we have a limitation on growth and carbon uptake in the ocean due to micronutrient iron. That was kind of a new thing at the time. Historically, this group should realize that, in 1993 was the first open ocean iron fertilization experiment. So in some ways, I'm first in this group. We've done the most over something like 30 years in terms of testing these ideas. Now, that those academic tests ended in 2009 after about 13 different experiments, many of them international, a few of them from the US. But we had a success as an academic community in showing the limitations on growth of plankton. So the uptake of CO2, they all resulted in a decrease in carbon dioxide in the surface ocean. But we didn't have the wherewithal or the urgency to be looking at CDR in the sense of longer timescales, durability, what you might want to do if you were to perturb a global cycle. So I think those were very successful. They give us a lot to look back on. And as I said, we pretty much had to look to Mother Nature for the longer, larger experiments, what happens after volcanic eruptions and other things. What I also want to then quickly get into then from this group's perspective is, it was around the 2000, the very first experiments, we did not ask for permission. We just put a ton of iron in the ocean and look what happened. That was allowed through the National Science Foundation, is where most of my funding came from. 2000 is really when we started to see, I experienced more the public alarm about geoengineering in general. I'd say there are probably three reasons. Mostly, number one was it was seen as an excuse for not reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. That was not our intent, but that was a public perception, very clear and still, I think, today. Secondly, don't mess with Mother Nature. Most oceanographers, we want to protect the ocean. We're out there to have a healthy ocean. That was certainly also not our intent, but certainly there was a lot of discussion about what could go wrong. None of that was shown. In my opinion, none of the experiments caused long-term ecological harm of any kind that we could measure, or these natural systems. And then the third reason, I think the for-profit companies kind of got ahead of the academic community in making promises they couldn't keep or couldn't demonstrate in terms of the effectiveness. So we had something that was being stopped, discussed 2009, the last experiment. If you remember, I was only here an hour from this group this morning, but the Convention on Biodiversity 2008, 2010 was issuing moratoriums on geoengineering, if you want to use that word. Certainly the London Protocols and the amendments 2013 were coming up with ways to regulate research, whether it's coastal areas and what research could be. It's still a little bit undefined. It took almost 20 years for that amendment, by the way, between the first experiment and when the London Protocol amendment was made. So it took a very long time. I personally think that that kind of scared off a lot of academic funders, certainly, and scientists from even trying to move ahead because of the complexity of the application process. You know, we have a cycle, and when you get funded, you want to get the ships in the water. You don't have to normally wait multiple years for permission. I think that also led to, unfortunately, some, I'll call them rogue experiments, because to put iron in the ocean, it's relatively cheap. You don't need very much to have a big effect. And so people, Heidegg Wise, the classic example, 2012, when people started promising fisheries restoration by enhancing iron inputs and therefore the base of the food chain that in that case, the salmon would lie on in their juvenile stages, so they would come back. And I think what was unfortunate, both early on when they were looking at carbon credits to commercial companies and then fisheries, is we never really had open, transparent data that we were allowed to see, both the public and the academics. Very frustrating to see these things happening where we could have gained a lot of knowledge, but essentially missed those opportunities. So really for the last 15 years, the last thing I wrote on this, I was able to get 16 scientists together for a piece in Science magazine to write, what was it, 750 words about the need to move forward, the sea of uncertainty that was there. That took 350 emails, by the way, to get those 750 words agreed upon, just because of all of the anxiety about what were we saying. We know the intention is to modify the ocean, to enhance its ability for, in this case, phytoplankton growth, to hopefully see the sequestration, the removal of that carbon deep enough so it'd be durable, and that you could quantify that and not have effects downstream or other greenhouse gases being produced, harmful algal blooms, things that I think we already, the academics were looking at. So, you know, I guess it's 2008, one of the statements that Science highlighted, I want to read, you know, it was premature to sell carbon offsets from ocean iron fertilization unless the research provides the scientific foundations to evaluate the risks and benefits. And that's kind of the, in a nutshell, what those words we were trying to say. And we were trying at that point to still continue on the research side, because I truly believe that, you know, what the research can take us to is a state where, you know, maybe there are places and times and scales when none of this should be done. I'll pick on ocean iron because that's what I work on, but it might allow it at some scale. And it's not a perfect analogy, but maybe like fisheries, you know, there's fisheries research. Not every country does a good job. We've overfished certain areas, but we need a foundational basis of understanding to even start making those regulations. And so that's why I'm kind of optimistic these last couple of years. things like the Paris Accord that acknowledge both reducing emissions and net negative things that are deeded like CDR. And so I think we're at a point where we could move ahead and make progress to tell society, to tell fellow academics more about the consequences intended or intending to alter the ocean. It will affect the surface, things like decreased ocean acidity, hopefully remove CO2 at levels that are meaningful. And then that will be basically speed up this biological pump. What's going to happen anyway if we were to do nothing, this carbon that we're putting into the ocean, the excess carbon, eventually will get deeper. So that's where we're at. And I'll leave it to the other panelists in Q&A to follow up.
All right. Thank you, Ken. Very instructive to look back at the past as we think about paths forward for the future. I am now going to turn to Max with Running Tide for more recent experiences. Max, please.
Yeah, sure. So it seems like you have disabled screen sharing here, but I'd like to be able to share some slides. Or Jen, I don't know if you can share the copy of the slides that we sent.
Let's see if I can get Molly to fix that. Molly, are you on there?
Try it now, Max. See if it works.
Yeah, it looks like it wants to do it now.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is not giving me a lot of, let's see, desktop number 2. Oh, wow. Okay. You know, this is humiliating. I have to give this thing permission. Brad, how do you feel about breaking your alphabet?
I am fine with that, Max.
Yeah,
So I'm going to move
all right.
right down the alphabet to Tom Green, Executive Director of Project Vesta.
Well, thank you for the alphabetical promotion. I appreciate it. I'm Tom Green, Executive Director of Project Vesta. So we are a research organization pursuing what we call coastal carbon capture. And this is really the practical application of a form of ocean alkalinity enhancement, which uses coastal enhanced weathering. So accelerating the natural weathering process by taking olivine sand, spreading it in coastal waters where it dissolves, adding alkalinity to the ocean, and removing CO2 primarily as dissolved bicarbonate in the ocean. We're currently at the lab stage, so we are engaged in numerous different lab and modeling studies, while at the same time beginning to lay the foundations for the first field trials of coastal carbon capture. So I guess a couple of things, a couple of sides to how we think about the regulatory framework here. I'd say the first thing is the regulations around deployment, and then the second would be the regulations around the need for CDR and sale of carbon credits and so on. So in terms of deployment planning, as I mentioned, we are while we're completing our phase of lab studies, we are beginning to lay the foundations for our first field trials. The first one we're planning to do is in the Caribbean, and we're already studying that site and sort of characterizing it. We went through a permitting process there to get permission to take samples, and then we're also engaged with a number of different sites in the US. And there's definitely a regulatory patchwork there. So, you know, you're looking at various different state level environmental departments, fisheries, Fish and Wildlife, EPA, the Army Corps has its own rules. If we're doing projects that involve them, plus local governments. So, you know, there's definitely a series of regulatory bodies that we have to engage with. So far, and it's early days for us. So you know, unlike Ken's comments, this is sort of our current experience rather than having sort of already been through it. But our experience so far has been, I would say, that there's a lot of need for education. Right, this solution is is a new idea to most people, even though it's been talked about in the literature for decades. And so we're spending a lot of time educating and just helping people to understand, what the point of all this is, and why we want to try it, why we think that society needs to know, whether it's safe or not, and how effective it is. So I think it's challenging that there's no sort of formal integrated regulatory framework here for CDR, right? When we talk to, not to pick on any given one agency, but when we talk to one agency, they're not particularly interested. I mean, they may be personally interested in CDR because they care about the climate crisis, but their job is not to be interested in that. And so there is, having some framework in which which was specifically created to balance the need that we have to investigate these kind of solutions with the impact of doing so would be very helpful, because we're sort of having to do everything within the existing frameworks. The second part of this is carbon credit sales, which, as everybody probably knows, there really isn't a meaningful framework from a policy standpoint at the federal level, at least, that supports CDR. You have some limited examples at the federal level, like 45Q, and certain states have their own emissions reduction targets, some of which include the need for CDR, but in many cases those are relatively ill-defined at this point. So we're not at the stage yet where we want to sell carbon credits, but we're also looking into the future, to that point where that will, we hope, become a reality, and we're looking into a very uncertain regulatory environment for doing so. I won't talk too much now. Maybe we'll get into it in the discussion about sort of the questions around the social license for ocean CDR and for coastal carbon capture specifically, but maybe just to kind of tease that now and say that this is an area of very significant interest for us. We think it's evolving. The views on CDR and views on the oceans, and yeah, we can get more into that in the discussion if it ends up going there.
Thank you, Tom. Much appreciated. Mac, are you ready to share, or should we?
I am, yeah. Nothing like some technical challenges, though, to get you on your back foot for one of these things. Okay, let's see. That's not what I want. I want this button. Awesome buttons. Okay, Brad, is this doing the thing that I want it to be doing here?
Looks like it. It's pretty small, but I can definitely see it.
All right, I don't know how to fix that, so I'm just gonna, you can all put on your eyeglasses. Okay, so my name is Max. I grew up on the ocean on Cape Cod, just a stone's throw away from you folks over at Hui. So I spent my early childhood wading around in tidal flats, and I spent my young adulthood working in boat yards. I'm a physicist by training and a data scientist by career. I run our science and policy teams here at Running Tide. So you guys heard from Marty yesterday. I'll just remind you, Running Tide is an open ocean kelp sinking project. So essentially we grow macroalgae on degradable flotation. We set them adrift in these ocean currents. They accumulate biomass as they drift, and eventually they sink to durable storage on the seafloor. Okay, we've all seen, the report. We've also seen all the news about the fires and the heat domes and droughts. So, the story is that we're out of time and that we need a massive amount of carbon removal, and we need it right away. So the purpose of this discussion, let's say, we need by mid-century to remove around 1,000 gigatons of carbon, to avoid civilization destabilizing warming. So we're going to call that, let's say, because the carbon removal methodologies tend to be project-based, let's think about that as 1 million megaton size CDR projects. We feel that the ocean, being one of being the largest system on the planet, should be able to be home to, let's say, half of that. So, we need the sort of technological and industrial capacity to perform 500,000 ocean projects, and right now we can do 0. Okay, so policy challenges. There are a lot of specifics I could talk about here. I think they would overlap a lot with the stuff that Tom just mentioned. But I'm gonna pick on Will today because he invited us here and because this quote came out this week. But I don't think that Will is the only person who holds a sentiment like this. And I feel that this quote sort of captures a lot of the conceptions out there, social license and policy and otherwise, that practitioners do need to communicate about. So we just want to take it head on. So the first thing I want to say is that all of the solutions we're talking about in this space are going to be scaled incrementally. This is something that Mike from Planetary Hydrogen pointed out yesterday when he was talking about the perils of talking about the gigaton scale. But the production ramp necessitates this incremental growth. And also it's the only way that society is going to let this happen. So, in order to build a megaton project, let alone many, many of them, it's going to take a lot of time and money and planning and just work. And there are a lot of checks and balances in the system here, whether it's public scrutiny or it's emerging scientific consensus, or it's just the fact that the carbon credit marketplace is methodology based. So it seems very improbable that a project that is ineffective or that is sort of needlessly harmful is going to continue to receive the attention and the resources it needs to build out to scale in the face of that scrutiny. But in the meantime, we do need to be just trying lots and lots of different ocean CDR projects and be continuously evaluating them against each other as we go. Okay, the second thing I want to mention, Will says here that we can massively alter ocean ecosystems. So, ocean ecosystems, like all the ecosystems on Earth, they're going to be massively altered. That is sort of baked in. The oceans are infiltrated with our plastics, they're infiltrated with our carbon, and they're infiltrated, with the heat from our carbon. That's sort of the baseline that we're in right now. I think we like to see the oceans as this sort of pristine ecosystem that should remain untouched by human hands, but you could also see the oceans as a sort of runaway train on the tracks that lead to total ecological collapse. And we saw a paper come out the other week talking about how phytoplankton communities can be largely impacted by surface temperature warming. That's where we get our oxygen from. So policy it must consider these ocean CDR projects in the context of a broader baseline of climate change. Okay, so the overarching, I think, sentiment here in a quote like this is that we should distrust private enterprise. And I think that, we all have a lot of good reason for feeling that way. In the climate space particularly, we definitely have to acknowledge that it's been corporate actors who have been responsible for most of the damage that's been done. But we are also on an all hands on deck situation. And kind of realistically in the history of our society, these kinds of massive emergencies require strong public-private partnerships to achieve the mobilization and the scale that they need to solve a crisis. I know Marty yesterday sort of conjured up the fact that the automobile industry provided the manufacturing to fight the Second World War, that the aviation industry got us to the moon. And of course, every single one of us, every piece of small talk we've engaged in the last 8 months has, had mentioned the names Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. So it's, government and academic labs have a really important role to play here, but they are not traditionally the place where scale mobilization can happen. So if the private sector is not where you want that sort of massive, durable, industrial carbon climate work to happen, what is the viable alternative? So, our feeling is that these public-private partnerships can be extremely fruitful and productive when people come to the table. And we need academic research to investigate, what can be possible, what the consequences are going to be. We need government involved, both because we need regulators. We're extremely anxious to have regulatory clarity, but we also need sort of top-down mobilization. But yeah, we also need the private sector, and that's because that's the part of our civilization that is best at doing, frankly, just doing a billion of something. So the policy question becomes, how do we structure a public-private partnership that is going to provide this governance, but is also going to create an avenue to identify and mobilize the projects that we're going to need to save the planet and also save ourselves. So we just don't see this as an either or between the private sector or the public sphere. We see this as a I don't want to like belabor this World War II analogy, but this is a let us go forward together in our united strength. So thank you.
Thanks, Max. Excellent. All right, Alyson, you are up next.
Great, thanks, Fred. So thank you very much for the conference to review current agreements and how we may incorporate marine CDR to protect our oceans and planet. We're delighted to see a multidisciplinary conference, so thank you. Practitioners very much need your expertise to encourage innovation. And let me say at the outset that working in oceans is neither easy nor for the faint of heart. Policymakers need to know that. So the US Department of Energy offered a fascinating challenge a few years ago to researchers looking at macroalgae as a biological tool. Could we figure out how to break the production scale barrier of a cottage scale industry to make progress on global climate goals? It was and is an ambitious question. Today, our work, funded by DOE RPE, focuses on scale production of macroalgae for CDR, or renewable fuel. Our approach is to use nature to the extent possible for macroalgae production, which is 31% carbon. We must show that the method can scale safely at an economically viable cost. So we use a floating alga, which established a new production system in 2011. It basically covers about 6,000 kilometers in the tropical Atlantic. Our method and target species is unique among macroalgae farmers, as we don't operate in a defined area, so our methods are different. We operate more like fishers, but we use technology, modeling, and logistics to design efficient harvest methods at the proper distance from shore. We have, since day one, internalized the precautionary principle, concern for endangered species, as well as habitat, as our goal is to benefit ocean chemistry and the planet. However, there are details. So the algae grows, as I said, from West Africa to the US and Caribbean over an area of multiple EEZs. The free-floating biomass arrives on the coasts. The oversupply causes economic and environmental damage. So the question is, can we protect the shorelines and repurpose the biomass for CDR or carbon utilization? And what of the regulatory regimes? The team this morning provided welcome information on the UNFCCC, the Convention of Biological Diversity, and the London Protocol. Domestically in the US, the same species was targeted several decades ago, long before CDR discussions by the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council as essential fish habitat. This prohibits the harvest from North Carolina to Florida of more than 5,000 wet pounds of biomass to protect the Sargasso Sea. We do not propose to harvest in or near the Sargasso Sea. Our area of operation is a novel system to the south, which is causing challenges to coastal environments. Today, the South Atlantic policy has not been updated, and Florida sends out bulldozers every morning in season at 7 a.m. to collect and truck the biomass to landfills. This method removes sand from the beaches and it burdens landfills. The Caribbean islands clear their beaches in a similar way. While they don't have the regulation, the US regulation has set a precedent, and other countries are collecting the biomass on land or in the first 50 meters. The methods are expensive, sand is removed, increasing erosion, and the biomass degrades in the warm coastal zones. It's truly mismanaged. There's today little or no standardization between regulatory regimes of the various countries. They are simply looking for practical solutions. They have in the past declared a state of emergency. We propose instead the government step back, prioritize the global goal of reducing emissions, search for opportunities where we as a society can address several problems with one infusion of capital. We need nimble policy that allows for testing of new methods to respond to changing oceans. The goal, to test, scale, and remove CO2. Let's craft a new policy to encourage innovation and allow for testing at a certain scale under government oversight. Verification is important, but this is not as hard as it seems. We have, for example, sunk biomass to 5,000 meters, which will remove that carbon from the system well beyond 100 years. We'll monitor that experiment and deploy others. We're not immediately recommending the sinking of biomass, as we will lose the value, the economic value of the other compounds in the biomass. We run these experiments because we need the data to compare one method of CDR to another. And let me add that we will get behind any methods that are good for the systems and accomplish the goal. Our current markets are sinking, carbon utilization, and renewable fuels. The policy imperative is to reflect the global need to quickly scale the removal of excess CO2. The status quo is untenable. Many people here have said that, and it's true. We're not funding adequately solutions to harmful emissions. We are instead on a path to acidifying our oceans, already under stress from heat, as you saw in Phil's slide from yesterday, but others have mentioned. If anything, we need to bring our oceans back to health for a greater capacity to store carbon, feed, and fuel the planet. Today, our team is made up of US national labs, marine engineers, and universities. Right now, we have tools. Let's use them. We look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyson. That was great. And finally, Bren Smith, please.
Hey, folks, total honor to be here. I will, what I want to talk about a little bit here is sort of reflections on the last 10 years of growing seaweed, and then talk about scale, and then the end of marine protected zones, hopefully. So I've been swimming in this offset credit sector for 10 years with like companies coming, sort of a community of passion around blue carbon, right? Which policymakers come, companies come, farmers come and really want to see this happen. And then 6 years before that with oysters. And if I were to look at the three lessons, one is I think policy is too slow. Funny enough, I don't think it's permitting policy. There are 197 seaweed permits in the US right now. It's actually climate policy is too slow, right? Like people put in bad permits, you put in good permits, we're actually seeing really pretty fast. The regulators are doing a great job. Second lesson is markets. The price is too low and markets are too slow, right? We're sitting here waiting, and $35 a ton when the UN wants $150 a ton to meet IPCC goals for 2030. The markets just aren't functioning as they should. We're seeing like yet another round of market failure. And third is research. Like research is necessary. We need to bring rigor, carbon offsets need to be traceable and high quality is what we think of in terms of blue carbon, but also research could be a black hole, right? It can stop innovation, it could go on forever, and it can soak up an incredible amount of funding while universities take 60% off the top of every single research project, right? I'm not, it isn't always the best method for innovation. So I think the result is you have a highly speculative carbon capture sector in seaweed, which is really good, right? It's high risk, big reward, but that's also too slow because the ocean is a very difficult place to grow plants. You can't see what you grow. Your soil turns over 1,000 times a day. You can't build hoop houses, things like that, like you can on land. So the highly speculative activities, which are attracting a lot of capital, which again is excellent, and I really believe in that, are from my perspective from a farmer, as I see the designs are going to take 10 years to come out of even R&D. And we only have 9 years before we all burn and drown, right? So all of this is happening really too slow. Meanwhile, like I said, 197 permits in the country. We've got farmers growing seaweed and not enough of it in the US, right? Growing these climate crops. So the question is, how do you not do what the markets want, but how do you get more kelp in the water? Right? And how you get more kelp in the water is recognizing those ecosystem benefits, no surprise here, and really align the incentives. So we went to farmers, and I still farm. I'm not a fake farmer, thank God. And the question is, what would make it worth it for you to keep planting kelp, right? And the answer is 10 cents a pound wet. And so we've got a new kelp climate fund, which works in 5 states, paying farmers $10 a pound wet. Wet weight, and then they can do whatever they want with the kelp. And we'll do this as the science comes in, we bring more rigor, but we're using philanthropic money to prime that pump. And then hopefully policy and markets will take that over, but we're just not gonna wait. And there's a precedence for this, like coming out of COVID, My Oysters, a mix of environmental nonprofits and government money came in and bought all My Oysters, and oysters all over the country at market rates, and then dump them into urban harbors to deal with pollution. And so, and the idea there was like, okay, these oysters, what the oystermen are doing, it's extremely beneficial, and we want to keep livelihoods alive. And I think that's where we get to this place where in climate policy, we need to keep linked saving the planet and saving communities, and address, I don't think many people disagree, but what does it look like in reality of linking livelihoods and sort of making a living on a living planet? And that means, that then goes to this idea of scale, and we can talk about scale, but like, what does scale look like? I'm not sure scale looks like a 1,000-acre farm owned by 3 guys that have the hatchery, the farm, the processing facility, and they're taking most of the profits. What a climate solution looks like is 110-acre farms, which is more inefficient. But maybe that's a good thing to deal with inequality, to achieve those policy goals of these 2 linked issues. So at GreenWave really care about this economic justice piece linked to climate change, which allows us to get social license, right? That message that you're going to benefit, you're going to get to be part of this blue collar innovation, you're going to get agency in your community to benefit, is what makes permits happen at the end of the day, right? I see permits stopped all the time, but I think there is a pathway that we can do here, but it doesn't necessarily look like big is necessary versus small is beautiful. It looks like replication is powerful, and that goes to the business model. Last thing I'd say is, if I were to wave my hand as a policy maker right now, I'd put an end to marine protected zones, which are about to come on line here, and I would turn them into blue carbon zones, right? You need something breathing life back into the ocean. I take 2,000 acres, have farmers doing reforestation of kelp forests. I'd have them growing food in polyculture systems, artisanal fisheries, and ecotourism. And you put those up and down the coast, and you're creating jobs, you're breathing life back in the ocean, you're achieving the goals of marine protected zones, but it's not about stay out, and it doesn't make communities and like guys who look like Trump supporters but aren't, like me, choose between jobs and the environment. Like, we all become part of this big climate solution standard. So lots more, but that's my drivel for today.
Well, thank you for that, Bren. That was great and provocative. It's always good to challenge marine protected areas if you want to just stir up a little bit of excitement in a room, especially with a lot of marine conservationists. But we'll let that one go aside because that's not what we're going to talk about. Now we're going to turn to a little bit of a discussion with the panel, and then we will be opening it up shortly to questions from the audience. So please be thinking about your questions, and we're going to use the hand raise function. So I'll need to be able to see that when we get there. But first, just to sort of recap, really great set of presentations from diverse perspectives, right? We started with the decade plus of experimentation in ocean iron fertilization and the various ways that went awry, the whole moral hazard argument, the risk averse nature of the science community to begin with, the involvement of rogue actors, to quote Ken, in doing things that were maybe far ahead of where social considerations were and where the science was. The emergence of the London Convention and London Protocol right in the midst of that to start to flex some international muscle to try and address this problem. A whole range of interesting things there. Tom then talked, about the sort of alphabet soup of agencies in the U.S., particularly, that you have to navigate in order to even figure out where you're going to get regulatory authority and governance direction, and the fact that there really isn't any formal interagency or integrated regulatory framework for this particular field. And also the whole issue around governance of carbon markets. We weren't even necessarily thinking about that part, that we've got governance of research and development, but we also have governance of this other market that's driving people to go into this field, right? Because there's an economic incentive. So that was I think a really good additive part to the conversation. Max brought up the issue about the role of government versus the role of the private sector here, which is a very interesting conversation, and one that we might look to the COVID crisis and response for some guidance as to what a public-private partnership can look like. Because I think in the COVID analogy, we saw a true public-private partnership, and the private sector did lead the way on a number of developments of things that very directly affect human health, and we accepted it. But the government was there pretty closely. Max also touched on what I call the no action fallacy. I didn't coin that phrase, but I love it because it basically suggests that the people who are citing the precautionary principle that we shouldn't do anything until we know the full effects are implicitly suggesting that no action is a safe course. And I think none of us really believe that's the case, but we do fall into that thinking, and it does affect governance and regulatory situations. Alyson, you talked about the fact that existing conventional structures are inhibiting what might be really good policy regarding the collection of sargassum, rather than letting it wash up as a public and environmental nuisance onto beaches, which in fact then creates methane, a more dangerous greenhouse gas. And yet, for some reason, the governments in the region are having a really challenging time coming together around a sound intergovernmental, cross-governmental framework for dealing with a problem that is massive, right? The lack of speed and attention to that. And then, Bren, I really liked your concept that it's not permitting policy that's necessarily too slow, it's climate policy, and that we just don't really have that kind of time. We do need to think about how we frame these structures and these industries going forward to build social license and to include people, to be inclusive, and to really play to the strong desire for blue and green jobs, and for both making a living and doing the right thing by the climate. So lots of really interesting concepts came out of this. I'm just wondering, maybe to start the question, does anybody have an analogy of a different sector or topical area that has got this right, that was able to carve through this sort of mass and mess that we've all just described, that we might look to as an example of how we could approach a governance and a regulatory structure in this space?
Well, I mean, Brad, you mentioned the COVID crisis, right? And drug development, vaccine development. It's I think, as you may have indicated, not a perfect analogy, but in that space you have the FDA, whose responsibility it is to balance the risks and benefits. And I think that's the key thing, that the do nothing scenario means we have no vaccine. The do something scenario is what we all want to explore. There are risks. They need to be balanced against the benefits to society at large. And, as Max talked about, the right engine for creating that kind of public health benefit at scale is commercial opportunity, appropriately constrained by government policy.
Chalfin.
So Brad, I don't know if this would work or not, but I do think about test centers. The US government is constantly setting up test centers to validate different methods of doing something. I think one of our challenges is that we need to step out of our current regulatory ideas and laws and say, all right, how do we get this done? Let's think in an innovative way about policy. So could we, it's just a question, view our fledgling methods within a framework of US government test facilities? Could we be a distributed set of test facilities? So it's just an idea from listening to people, but I think the point of looking beyond our current structures is maybe a good idea. Thanks.
Thanks. Anybody else want to weigh in on that particular question of whether there's any good analogies that we can learn from quickly to try to make progress in this space?
Yeah, Brad, can I say something? I'm going to say something a little bit crazy and maybe a little dark here that I probably will regret drawing an analogy, but I think that there's maybe a lesson to be learned in sort of like knowing thy enemy here, right? Which is, you know, we're trying to fight a problem that was essentially excavated by the fossil fuel industry. That is a machine that our civilization has built that can operate on this enormous scale across the entire world. Now, obviously, there are a lot of things we don't want to reproduce there, right? There's an incredible amount of secondary environmental harm, and probably a lot of the processes that they use to establish themselves and like throughout the, has been a little bit less legitimate. But I do think that there probably are, there probably should be some scrutiny, right? As just a sort of historical civilizational lesson of like, how did this thing come to be, and what are the pieces of that machinery that could be repurposed here? I mean, so to being that a little bit more concrete, this isn't really a policy question, but like, we do often talk about the ability to kind of like repurpose OSVs or oil tankers as, mechanisms for deploying CDR solutions into the ocean. Maybe there's also kind of an analogy there in the policy space.
Great. So
I was going to just say,
go ahead, Ken. Yep.
On the analogy that, maybe it's not really working, but this fisheries to me seems comparable. If you wanted to protect the ocean, we'd stop fishing. We would say, we don't want to get protein. We're not going to take anything from the ocean at all. That would protect our ocean. But yet we accept that need. And in a very imperfect way, we have private sector players, we have government agencies, we have international regulations. Somehow we move ahead. We keep trying to get it better. I see this moving forward more in that sense, that it's never going to be perfect. If we keep waiting for it to be perfect, we won't do anything. And then we all don't want those consequences, but we need to admit that we are going to have some failures, but we should keep moving ahead if this is how we think we should go with public and governments, that type of structure.
So let's take that one for a second. As a comparison rather than an analogy, fisheries management in the U.S. has clear designated authority, right? With a lead agency, there are other agencies that are between federal and state agencies that are typically involved in fisheries management, but you do have a lead agency. If we were going to try to create that in the U.S., let's just stay with the U.S. for a minute, where would you see the lead agency for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal being, and what would be, what kind of enabling legislation would be necessary or authorization for that agency to be able to help make the kind of testing and development happen that we need to see happen?
I'll just jump in. I mean, I actually think NOAA, oddly enough, is the perfect place because it's under the Department of Commerce. And there is just a fascinating nexus of interests and conflicting interests, which is good. That's what you want, because it brings rigor, and there's just incredible data-driven decision-making in there, but with an economic framework. I mean, Elizabeth Warren's Blue New Deal was the beginning of this, right? Trying to under a frame of climate policy, talk about things like blue carbon zones and creating a climate fund under NOAA to pay for restoration and reforestation of our oceans, things like that. So anyway, I almost keep it where it is, right?
Except they don't have authority for this particular area at the moment. But yes, I take your point. Max, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we also, believe that NOAA is probably the appropriate lead agency here. It seems very much in line with not only their mandate, but also their expertise. We would love to see them in that position. I think right now, obviously, it's hard to get clear guidance about who sort of controls. As far as the process goes, though, one of the things that we talk a lot about is we do think that policy needs to kind of acknowledge that there's not going to be one solution to this problem. We're going to have a portfolio of different technologies, and the regulators should think about building the portfolio rather than evaluating each individual project on its own. I think that would allow a sort of holistic kind of sense of weighing the different specific ecological risks associated with each project against each other, trying to like diversify across those risks, and also thinking a little bit more systematically about allocating resources, research funding, and other resources to these projects.
Any thoughts? And sorry, anybody else have any thoughts on that? And what would be, and I'll just add to the question, do we need some sort of an interagency structure that is designated by Congress and or the executive, maybe with NOAA in the lead, but to lead on this, as we've seen in other, in other settings?
I mean, with climate issues, we have NOAA, we have DOE, we have NSF, EPA. And so in some ways, they all have their own way to offer something to questions like this that cross these different boundaries. So I was going to say no. I think we're kind of interested in agreement maybe on a lead, but I don't think that has to exclude it. And the interesting I'm finding is just the philanthropic, these foundations that have now come out who want to help. So these kind of partnerships to me are something we should embrace and try and find more of those kinds of sponsors as well.
Right. And, we have to give some credit to DOE and especially ARPA for the work that it's done through the Mariner program. I'm not sure, I think that agency is set up to do that kind of accelerated research, development, and testing, maybe more than NOAA.
It was, I'll just say, having been part of that on two of the projects, it was amazing. I was actually quite worried walking into it, but it was just incredible. And the direct impacts of through that project, we were able to increase yields per acre by a factor of 5, right? Just wall thinking huge and very ambitiously. And they just did a great job at moving the ball forward in the short term with the long term. And I went in very nervous.
But I want to second that. We're also an awardee, and I honestly, well, first of all, it was a phenomenal job on Mark's part to get the funding for that program. It was so prescient at the time to make that program happen. But the point is that as we were working with their team, I really feel like we were one team together trying to reach the goals. And they push really hard. It's not easy trying to make something new and economically viable, but I always felt like they had our back as they were pushing us harder and harder. And it was a great experience. If we could duplicate, ARPA-E for this, I think it would be phenomenal. So maybe, in your envisioned committee or oversight agency, NOAA would be in the lead, but ARPA-E and others may be in the room, as long as the strategy is to go forward and go as fast as you can at the scale that's appropriate.
Thanks. So, we couldn't only be North American centric or US centric. Obviously, there's 190 or 200 other countries in the world that could play a role in ocean-based carbon removal, and all of whom have their own national regulatory and governance frameworks. And then we have 40% of the planet in the high seas, which are governed in different ways, but in the case of ocean-based CDR, maybe a governance gap other than the convention and the protocol. Would there be anything off the top of your heads at the international level first that would really help any of your projects? I mean, I know, for example, Ken, the iron fertilization was in the high seas, as I recall. Any new structure or repurposing of an existing international structure that would be helpful here?
I think the amendments to the protocol were helpful in a way because it really put in place something we could point to. And we haven't heard the word code of conduct, and people ask, how can we trust the private sector? But if we all have similar agreements that we agreed to follow in terms of permitting and then open data, things that go beyond just what's in that protocol, then I think we could move forward, whether it's through a private sector or philanthropic or agencies. And so I do think that does help, even if we haven't signed off on it, right? Very few people have signed off on that amendment, and US is a partner. But it gives us a way to say, okay, we want to move forward. We will follow these internationally agreed protocols, and let's take those next steps. And at least for research scientists, that's helpful to have that sort of guidance. I think we could follow that if we were allowed.
Alyson, what about your perspective for the Caribbean region with all the nations that have that bear on the sargassum issue?
Thanks for the question. We presented to ICRLP, so that's within UNESCO, to a day-long meeting on sargassum. And the impression that I got was that there was a lot of willingness to work together, but there was very little budget. And so, my thought is that it would be phenomenal for the US to take the lead on a regional proposal. I think some leadership is needed. Right now, individual countries and really down to individual businesses are just trying to protect their beaches. And so whether a barrier that's set up sends the biomass elsewhere, it's not really handling the problem. And so I think there needs to be a different way of looking at this. And that's what I would propose. I think it's needed.
So we're going to turn to audience questions in just a minute, but I wanted to direct that for the same question to Tom. You mentioned you're working in the Caribbean. What's been your experience working with a different government, outside of the U.S.? Has it been more receptive to this kind of approach, more willing to deal, more difficult?
A lot of people criticize us for working outside of the US because they assume that their regulatory environment is a lot more permissive. I would say that what we've experienced is that the regulatory environment has been simpler. So, I named a whole bunch of different agencies that are involved in the pilots that we're looking at in the US, and in the country that we are working in the Caribbean, which we haven't announced the location yet, so unfortunately I can't share it here. But in that country, it's a smaller place, and so there are fewer agencies involved. We have, so I think one of the impacts of that is it sort of raises the level of the discussion a little bit, because we are actually having a conversation about the benefits and how they may, and how they may balance against the risks of doing this, and what's the appropriate size deployment to do, and so on. So it becomes, I think, a little bit more of a, you could say ironically, going to a smaller country, it becomes actually a little bit more of a sophisticated discussion, because it's sort of meeting at a higher level in the trade-offs. And so what we found is it's a new thing, so a lot of questions. We found it to be a rigorous process, and we found that we're sort of forging a path, right? There was no framework in place for doing this, so we have been working with the agencies there to create the right milestones for us to hit. So, for example, before we ever put olivine down in any coastal area, we want to make sure that we've done testing, local ecotoxicology testing on local organisms, that we fully characterized the environment so we can make sure that the experiment's actually going to be useful, because we have a baseline, and so on. And so all of those requirements exist there, and they've sort of been developed in consultation with us, because this is a new thing.
Thank you for that. Okay. I want to open it up to the audience, but I'm just going to make a comment before I do about the fact that there are many other sovereign nations in the world, many of whom have ocean zones. all of whom have a legitimate national right to pursue this sort of an approach if they're in their own waters. And so, lest we get too focused on only trying to slow something down and build the perfect structure in the US, we're likely to see they don't have to be rogue actors, as was used earlier, that term. They could just be other actors from other places moving forward in this space. And so forging ahead with things like codes of conduct, with frameworks for responsible research that with transparency, with model governance arrangements, getting out ahead might make a lot of sense for us to be doing as responsible stewards of the ocean. With that said, Phil, I saw that you had your hand up earlier. Would you like to ask a question?
Well, it was a bit of a comment and anecdotal, I guess, on the permitting, and maybe this is not Jordan. We did get a permit in Oregon in 2011, 2012 from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for 3 miles out beyond the state waters to conduct wave testing short-term. We got permits in Peru and Newfoundland. Peru, we actually got to the Commandant of the Navy and he signed off. In Newfoundland at the College of North Atlantic has a wave energy test site near shore, pre-permitted. So that's just anecdotal historic evidence of the permitting scene that we've taken advantage of. On the government tests, not a big fan in all cases. There is a wave energy test site off Oregon to test wave density for motion waves. We gave up on that a long time ago, and I don't think it's economic, but they're still spending a lot of money on it. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Will Burns, I see your hand.
Yeah. So I think I heard some disparaging of the concept of the precautionary principle, and I just want to make sure that we don't caricature what the precautionary principle actually means in international law and how it's applied. I think it needs to be emphasized that the precautionary principle doesn't mean that you should stop everything or that it's intended to stop everything. It indicates that when there's high levels of scientific uncertainty with potentially irreversible or highly negative impacts, it justifies taking precautionary measures, right? And I think that's salutary in the context of the ocean-based approaches that we're looking at the current state of knowledge or lack of knowledge, right? And if you look at the London Convention's resolution in 2013, I think it's a quintessential and kind of salutary example of application of the precautionary principle. It says we should only, given the high scientific uncertainty about ocean iron fertilization, the experiments should only be small scale. We shouldn't have a commercial motivation because, as Ken indicated, we had private corporations and rogues who did get out ahead of the science and were seeking financial gain in a way that was potentially deleterious. And so it restricted that. And it said we needed a risk assessment that was passed off on by the government in which the vessel was flagged or the materials had come from. And that all strikes me as highly advantageous, advantageous for balancing the interests of the world of stakeholders, and also I think in the long term, from a standpoint of investors, probably the sort of thing that they're going to want. So the precautionary principle, I think, in this context is actually highly beneficial for the CDR community and highly beneficial for the global community in protecting its interests.
Yeah, thanks for that, Will. I don't think it was a derogatory or deprecating remark about the precautionary principle. It was more the fact that it has been used in many instances to slow things down very dramatically with the concept that doing nothing is safe. And I think, again, back to the COVID crisis, we saw very clearly a change in the application of the precautionary principle with how we approve drugs. in the face of an emergency. And so if we are truly going to keep calling the climate crisis an emergency, which we all do, if we're actually going to believe that and act on it, we need a different application of that principle.
You know, just
and I would just Will, I agree. I think your perspective on the precautionary principle is very sophisticated and nuanced, and is something that I think we can pretty much all get on board with. I think some of the challenge is that's not the way everybody applies it, right? So there are a lot of people out there who think that all CDR is evil, or who think that any intervention in the ocean is evil, forgetting conveniently that we've already made them 30% more acidic. And so, just highlighting there that the precautionary principle is not one thing. And I think the Will Burns version of it makes a lot of sense, but there are other versions of it out there that make less sense.
Yeah, but I think the good news for the CDR community is the London Convention version is the Will Burns version. The CBD version is actually the Will Burns version. I mean, again, I think some people in the geoengineering community have caricatured what the CBD said, right? Which is it's a moratorium. It's not. It provides for small scale research. When the CBD wants to impose a moratorium, they impose something called a moratorium. And they've done it before on other things, right? They didn't say that with these things. They said small scale, risk assessment, no profit motive, essentially what London did, right? So I think that the regimes that you're engaging with as project developers are on the same page as you. And I'm just saying we want to make sure that that everybody remembers that, and what the ETC group may think the precautionary principle is not what most of the regulators do.
Hey, just let me
I like the way we've just branded it as the Will Burns version of it.
Just to push back on that for a second, though, Will, one of the parts that you mentioned was no profit motive. So basically what you're saying is that the private sector really shouldn't be involved in developing this. And let's again go back to COVID. The profit motive was enormous for the drug companies that engaged in that race for a vaccine. They shelved much of their other work, right? So I don't know how practical it is to say that we need to sideline anybody who has a profit motive and hope that public sector is going to pay for all the necessary research.
Well, that's not what they're saying, though. What they're saying is the initial research. What they're trying to do is scaffold this in a way that ensures that the interests of all pertinent stakeholders are recognized, assessed, and protected, right? And they said in the initial stages, prior to when governance has been established and there's more certainty of the science, they want the research to be small scale. They don't want credits to be sold because, as Ken has indicated, again, in terms of ocean iron fertilization, our experience with the only ocean CDR projects we ever had, we saw the private sector do some things that were frightening. And so what London has said is that at the outset, we want it to be done this way. And it contemplates subsequently allowing, assuming the experiments bear out, I think plenty of private sector activity. Certainly the London Convention deals with a lot of maritime interests, right, that are all about, it's the IMO.
Right.
It's all about profit.
Bren, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as sort of a micro case study of it, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which I, had a real knee-jerk reaction to when I was trying to permit, and everybody's worried about the turtles, and like, I'm a fisherman, right? And I'm like, we're going to lose a couple turtles, right? You know what I mean? As we fight climate change. That's how I came in. But what was interesting when we started engaging with NOAA and co-design, and I was worried like NOAA was going to come in and ruin our farm designs, which was going to make it unviable as a business, right? Like that's sort of the tension. And we work with them, and just in practice, what it means is your farm designs, you want a lot of tension, right? And so we're able to design to make sure everything's tense and actually do some boat design. And so we're able to maintain that at really low cost. And then GreenWave, the nonprofit's role, our organization, was to then create a farm design tool that people can put in their depths and acres and things like that. And it spits out farm designs that take into, that reflect that negotiation, right? and then normalize the farm designs, give permitting language. We're just rolling that out in the next 2 months. But I think that's like and again, I'm the guy not to support the precautionary principle, right? Because I want to go chase some fish, right? I'm a hunter. But I really learned a lot in that process, and I think the intermediary role of a non-financial actor like GreenWave, but that's there to promote entrepreneurship and economic development, not an environmental organization. Really, we were able to sort of hit a sweet spot there.
Yeah, I gotta say, I just don't know, Will. I think that the cautionary principle as it's applied through the London Convention, is not really set up to have this system be built in the time frame that it needs to be built. I was going to say, Brad, when you asked about what kind of international policy we would want to see, and I think that would specifically be reformation or clarification of ocean dumping or the London Convention to provide for the scale growth that would happen after the research step. I mean, putting checks and balances in place, absolutely. But when you think about investing in this space and you say like, okay, well, there's a permitting pathway to get research done, but then after that, then what? It becomes a pretty hard investment prospect where you say, well, some international action is going to then have to happen to allow this. And certainly the way that dumping is permitted through the EPA, through the MSRPA, all of that exists to greatly constrain the activity, as it should be, right? The ocean dumping is not a thing we want to be doing for without good constraints. But when we talk about ocean CDR, we want to see a way to grow this platform to gigaton scale, in the time that we need it to be built. And I think that the big piece of this that isn't being appreciated is that it takes time to understand how to build these big systems. Process engineering is a science, industrial science. It takes time. It needs field work. We need to be able to get up that learning curve. We can't figure out all the laboratory science in a box and then start thinking about, to Bren's point, how do we start retraining, blue collar communities to do this new type of work? How do we start figuring out like, what are the, there are going to be gotchas, there are going to be unknowns in this system here. And we need to go start turning over all the stones and finding out what they are. And so, that is the thing that the commercial sector does. And it can't do it alone. It can't solve this problem alone. But there's a role to play here. And I think shutting that sort of avenue for innovation down at this stage, is a real limiting factor.
I think
I had a question from Catherine Mansell. I want to give her a chance to ask a question.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. But apologies in advance. It's nothing to do with the precautionary principle. So if people are really enjoying this bit of the conversation and finding it useful and constructive, then we can stay on this and park my question. It's fine.
Why don't we let Ken just have a word on the precautionary principle, and then we'll go back to you, Catherine.
No
Well,
worries.
it's just the way that got brought forward. You mentioned small experiments and assessments. So the devil's in the details, and what does that regulating body call small? Because in case of ocean iron, we've done some I still call small experiments. So that could be limited. And then who's making the assessment? And the quote I like to give is people 2010 were standing up at meetings and saying even the research would be more devastating than Deepwater Horizon oil spill that was going on at the time. And so if the people making the assessment have that attitude, then nothing can happen. So it's just getting some clarity around that. Precautionary principle to some people seems to mean different things, from do no action to allow small things, but that's where the problem comes.
Okay, thanks. All right, over to you, Catherine.
Okay, well, I hope people didn't get whiplash because it's a very different question. So my question was about the US National Academy of Sciences assessment report earlier this year on geoengineering, which is obviously, from their perspective, it was a pretty broad church. It had references to CDR. It was still very top line. And I just wondered, given that it ended up being bigger in scope, consulted multiple agencies and private individuals, like there were, philanthropy was more involved than was expected at the beginning of that report being commissioned. And I just wondered, what your feeling was after that came out. It was what, a few months ago now. I mean, I've lost all sense of time with COVID, but I think maybe 4 months, maybe 5. And I just wondered if it has helped break down any barriers between agencies, if it's changed anything at all, or is it just a useful report to have on the shelf? I'm just trying to work out how this helps or not.
Anybody want to take a crack at that? Ken.
Well, you'll see, in my academic silo, I'm not actually looking at that report. I'm working actively on a new report from the academies, sponsored by ClimateWorks on ocean CDR. That should be out in time, November, the COP conference in Glasgow. And we're hoping at least that the audiences we reach, which are varied, are going to then have some at least state-of-the-art assessment where each of these, we were tasked to look at 6 of the CDR technologies very specifically. That's a little bit frustrating when you're on a committee because there's many, many more. But I think they do serve a purpose because that at least got the 12 of us to really put down at this point in time state of the science and then consider research plans. The difficulty in those committees, and I can't give anything away, it's not out there, but it's just setting priorities and putting budgets, right? That's a whole nother level, but we're trying to do our best to give some guidance. But I think it follows a lot of what you're hearing. We need to be looking in a lot of different ways to look at the ocean as a repository. And so I hope that report has an impact and allows potential sponsors to say, okay, I could do that. That fits within my portfolio of interests, whether it's kelp, whether it's alkalinity, electrochemical, or ocean iron. You might be able to find people, okay, with these understanding and constraints. But it is a pretty slow academic step forward that probably will lead to slow academic progress, hopefully, kind of on a 5 to 10 year time frame is what we're looking out for. So it's not quite the answer, but it's where we're at with the new report coming out soon, under review as I speak here today.
I think, Catherine, the other sort of part of the answer to your question is that report on SRM by NASM gave credibility to the topic that didn't exist for many people before that report came out. And it does have a research agenda. So it's saying that research in this area is legitimate. And I think what Ken is talking about with the Ocean CDR report will continue to do the same thing for Ocean CDR, which is already far more legitimate of a pursuit than SRM, I think, in the minds of climate policymakers. SRM is sort of a last resort in some ways. Ocean CDR is a step on the way to that one of those last resorts, as is CDR generally seen. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions if anybody else in the audience has a question. I noticed John Sherrill put something in here about an EPA, potential EPA authorization for carbon dioxide removal. Do you want to say anything about that, John?
Yeah, that's a pretty hopeful development of September 13th. The House Energy and Commerce Committee, in marking up its piece of the House Budget Reconciliation Bill, the $3.5 trillion bill, included in the methane fee portion of its air pollution title, a devotion of a portion of the 75% of the methane fee to be collected by EPA collected by IRS to EPA for the development and deployment, among other things, of greenhouse gases that are legacy emissions from the oil and gas production facilities and transmission facilities. That's the first directive that I know of from the federal government to get greenhouse gas removal technology up and running. And this is very, very positive development, I think, as long as we can keep that in the Senate side and in the final budget reconciliation thing that Bernie Sanders and his House counterpart will produce, and hopefully produce with a vote that's inclusive of all these provisions. And there are many other good things in there, but that was a real breakthrough. And I put the language in the chat.
Thank you. Appreciate that. It's good to recognize that these things can really change on a dime with a clear statement of policy intent from the government. That's one of the things we most lack, perhaps. All right, well, if there are no more questions, maybe I'll just give each of you 30 seconds for one final parting shot, and we'll go in reverse alphabetical order. So Bren.
I was just saying in the chat, like, I don't know if we're at this moment of where land-based agriculture was, and maybe, I don't know, when the 70s or 80s, like, are we all the same? Are all our projects the same? And I really don't know, I don't want to jump to that, right? Because I'm such a climate emergency. We have to scale, think huge, out of the ashes, 1,000 solutions. There will be failure. We have to scale, like all these sort of things. But each project is going to have blowback. So if it's poorly done, doesn't understand social psychology, the politics, it's going to hurt those of us that have incredible. I mean, we have 8,000 people on our waiting list right now for farming training in the US, right? Like, that is not true of many other projects, right? So anyway, let's see where that goes, but I hope we're all friends, but let's see.
Thank you. Alyson.
The global goal is really going to require all of us to work together. So Bren, I'm backing up what you're saying. When I go to diplomatic meetings, I find that everyone wants to solve the problem or at least make progress on it. But you need the technological solutions in the room. Otherwise, they can't move. So when you look at bottlenecks, the bottleneck is at the innovation and the scaling. We've got to remove the impediments to get that done so that the policymakers can then act and the investors can come in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom.
Well, thank you, Brad. Well, everybody, really good discussion. Lots of nice and healthy conflict as well. Yeah, I mean, I'll echo a little bit of what's been said. I think that the social license for all of this is incredibly important, and there are risks to all of us if one of us does something that's cutting corners. So I think that there's a requirement and obligation on us all to not just do things by the letter of the law, but really to understand how people view it, both on a national scale and on a local scale, and try to kind of build in participatory governance and local benefits into the way that we execute these projects in order that we can collectively build a more holistic case for ocean CDR beyond just sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Awesome. Max?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I echo all three of you. Alyson, I think you're absolutely right. We feel like we're trying to build, one item on the menu for, policymakers and investors to choose the portfolio from. Bren, I think that there's, like the best possible outcome, I think, for, from our point of view is like, other projects are just so successful at pulling CDR pulling carbon out of the air that there's just no room in the market for us, right? I mean, there's just no reason for us to be working at cross purposes here. And frankly, it's an enormous problem, and we would be lucky if it gets saturated with solutions. So, that's where we stand on that. And then Tom, I think your point is very well taken. But I think that, I think that's part of the reason why it's so important for conversations happening like in institutes like this, to think very critically about the roles of all participants here, because we don't want to be shutting out shutting out actors, forcing them into rogue roles. That would be terrible. But I think also, the more that we can invite people into the tent, the more that we can really kind of help, kind of make that sort of social fabric and socialize the problem and really talk about it, openly.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ken.
Yeah, I think more and more it's the social side where we need to work harder on. The research I think we can do. We've heard a lot about, I'm optimistic that society is finally realizing with enough wildfires and storms and observed melting of sea ice in the Arctic and other places that they kind of get it. We have to do something. And so moving ahead seems now possible. I'm encouraged by the philanthropic funding that's come behind some of this. And so I'll just end that. I think Brad heard me get this quote from the Dalai Lama. 2012, he actually sat on a stage, a panel, not unlike this, talking about geoengineering and climate. And when asked about moving forward with research on that, his short number of words was that it is our responsibility to look. And so I hope we all take that mantra and move ahead and help move this forward. So end on those words.
Thanks. And thanks to all of you for participating. Before I turn it to Will, I'll say my final words, which is ask yourself if you really do believe it's an emergency, or if that's just words we use. And if the answer is yes, then ask if what you're doing reflects the fact that we're in an emergency. What might be a race for the lives of ourselves, our children, and many other living organisms on the planet. It's not the past. It's not how it was. And the way we worked in the past isn't going to work for the future. It's going to have to be different. Ask yourself those questions, see what your answers are. Will.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. Great panel. Thank you, everyone, for your insights. And we look forward to engaging with similar panels at future conferences. I think it's really helpful, including the conflict. That's how we're going to figure things out. So I appreciate it. So thank you, everyone.